Dude, have you ever stopped to think what would happen if Shin Godzilla invaded the MonsterVerse in its final form from the movie? Because it's one thing for this creature to turn Tokyo into hell, it's quite another for it to fall into a world where titans like Kong and Godzilla already exist, right? Hey there, my friend. Everything alright? Today I'm going to show you who could take on Shin in this universe, and why even that might not solve the problem. Dude, imagine this. If Shin Godzilla appeared in the MonsterVerse, the first question wouldn't even be, is he strong? That would already be answered the instant that creature started streaking across the sky with its atomic breath and spreading destruction in multiple directions at once. The real question would be, who can stop it before the damage gets completely out of control? Because Shin wouldn't enter this universe like an ordinary titan. He would arrive as an anomaly. A creature that doesn't fight like the others, doesn't move like the others, and doesn't destroy like the others. When he enters that maximum state, the entire surrounding space becomes a death zone, and that in the MonsterVerse would be enough to compel an immediate response. But here's the most interesting part. The MonsterVerse isn't a defenseless world waiting for a new titan to appear. It's a universe where titans already exist, accustomed to heavy warfare and territorial disputes. So, would Shin arrive as a disaster? Yes, but he would also be stepping into a place where creatures exist who are truly capable of facing this kind of threat. You understand? He wouldn't be the only one who's different, and that's precisely what makes this situation so interesting. Because Shin's invasion wouldn't be a simple story of he would destroy everything and that's it. Nor would it be the opposite, as if the alphas of this universe resolved the situation without difficulty. Most likely, the initial clash would be heavy for both sides. Shin would arrive imposing a level of devastation that no one in that world would ignore. But from the moment he crossed paths with the right or wrong titans, the response would also be equally strong. Imagine what it would be like in the first few hours, man. The scenario would be crazy, because Shin isn't the type of creature that arrives asking for time to be understood. If he invades the MonsterVerse, his entrance would basically be a mass destruction event, the kind of threat that changes the climate of the situation even before any main titan appears to respond. And this matters because the initial impact wouldn't just be physical, it would be global. Monarch, the military, and anyone trying to understand what just happened would immediately see that they weren't dealing with an ordinary titan. The Shin doesn't look like a classic alpha titan. It doesn't seem to follow the natural logic of that world, and when it goes into discharge mode, it turns the entire area into hell. So the initial reaction would likely be containment, evacuation, and a desperate attempt to buy time until a titan large enough could get involved. But that time would be costly, because Shin wouldn't need to chase after anyone for it to already be a disaster. He would simply need to advance, unleash his energy, and turn the surrounding area into a death zone. And that's important. Some monsters destroy because they literally chase after them. Shin, on the other hand, destroys because simply being near him becomes impossible when he enters that state. From there, the MonsterVerse would do what this universe always does when a threat crosses the line: respond with titans. And this is where the invasion gets even more interesting, because Shin could even overwhelm the human structure and spread panic. But the game changes the moment he stops being just a city problem and becomes a problem of balance between the titans. In other words, the first few hours would be a massacre, yes, but they would also be the moment when the MonsterVerse would stop treating Shin as just another catastrophe and start treating him as what he truly was within that universe: a threat big enough to force a response from the alphas. If Shin's first major encounter in the MonsterVerse was with Kong, man, the fight would be way more complicated than it seems at first glance, because this is precisely the type of confrontation where rhythm, distance, and reading the fight matter more than it seems. And that already makes the confrontation interesting right from the start, because Kong would be a terrible enemy for Shin in one very specific way. He wouldn't just stand there admiring the size of the problem. Kong is the kind of titan that goes in to win no matter what. He changes angles using the environment, abuses his mobility, tries to close the distance quickly, and looks for openings before the other side can dominate the fight. Against a creature like Shin, this would make a lot of sense. If he realized that giving the monster space to unleash its energy comfortably is suicide, the tendency would be to adopt an aggressive approach from the beginning. But that's where the enormous risk lies for Kong himself. And there's a detail that could significantly change the course of this fight. Kong doesn't need to go in unarmed. If he has the axe, for example, the narrative changes considerably, because he ceases to be just the titan disrupting the rhythm and gains a real chance to turn a well-timed approach into brutal damage. Then the confrontation becomes even more dangerous for both sides. Kong would still be at enormous risk if he mistimed Shin's attack, but he would also no longer rely solely on mobility and pressure. He would then wield a tool capable of truly punishing if he found the right opening. Because unlike many enemies he'd faced before, Shin wouldn't just be dangerous from the front. If the fight escalated to the point where the entire body was on fire, Kong wouldn't just be dealing with a concentrated breath attack. He'd be dealing with a creature capable of turning the entire area into a threat. And that's terrible for a titan that relies so heavily on mobility and close-range combat. So, for me, this fight would have two very different moments. At the beginning, I can see Kong doing better than many people would imagine, precisely because he manages to pressure, change positions, and try to prevent Shin from creating hell in the ideal way. However, if the confrontation drags on and Shin manages to get into the peak of his attack, the margin for Kong starts to become dangerously small, because then it's no longer enough to be fast. He would practically need to get everything right at the perfect time to avoid becoming a target in an area where danger comes from multiple sides. Therefore, my guess here is this: Kong would have a real chance of making life very difficult for Shin, especially if he fought in an environment with cover, elevation, and a good approach route. But in a more open field, and with Shin able to unleash his maximum power, the fight would start to tilt in his favor. Not because Kong would be weak, but because this is a confrontation where the cost of making even one mistake can be too enormous. Now, if Shin were to run into the Godzilla from the MonsterVerse, the conversation would change drastically, man. Because then he wouldn't just find a strong titan. He'd find a monster built for war, accustomed to enduring heavy combat and continuing to fight even when the scenario has turned into hell itself. And that weighs heavily in this duel. Because the Godzilla from the MonsterVerse wouldn't give Shin the kind of space he'd most like. He wouldn't wait too long, wouldn't retreat to observe calmly, and much less would he let that creature dominate the pace of the fight without a response. If he recognized Shin as a threat, the tendency would be to do what he always does: apply pressure and turn the combat into a contest of endurance. But this confrontation wouldn't be easy for Godzilla, because unlike many enemies he had faced before, Shin wouldn't be dangerous just because of his body or just because of his breath. The problem would be the whole package. If he managed to reach that maximum discharge state, Godzilla wouldn't just be dealing with a beam coming from the front. He would be dealing with a creature capable of spreading destruction in multiple directions and transforming the entire area of the fight into a much more hostile place than normal. And that would force even Godzilla to take great care of what he's facing, because the risk of getting badly hurt right from the start would be real. Even so, in a fight to the end, my guess is for Godzilla from the MonsterVerse, especially if we're talking about his new evolution, Evolved. And the main reason is the type of fight he can sustain, in addition to the monstrous level of energy he can now tolerate. Think about it. Shin may have a terrifying, destructive peak, but Godzilla seems much more prepared for a long war. He can take a beating, keep pressing, and has shown several times that he remains dangerous even when the other side also has absurd power. So to take down a beast like that, it's not enough to cause damage. You have to maintain that damage for long enough, and that's where I think Shin's mission is more difficult. So in my opinion, Shin would cause monstrous damage, forcing Godzilla to fight seriously from the start, and probably turning the entire field into hell. But if the fight went to the end, I'd bet on the MonsterVerse Godzilla as the winner. The point is that holding Shin back once might not solve the problem completely. It might only prevent the first catastrophe. The most interesting way to imagine this situation, man, is to think that Shin wouldn't be an enemy a Titan could just handle with a clean exchange of blows. He would be the kind of creature that would force the MonsterVerse to respond in sequence, without giving space, without giving time, and without letting that monstrosity fight the way it wants. The only exception I would really make here is the evolved Pink Godzilla, because if there's a monster in this universe capable of facing Shin alone and still having a real chance of winning the fight, it's him. This form was built precisely for a level of threat above normal, with more accumulated energy, more power, and an even more oppressive presence. So, if anyone could turn such a confrontation into a war of attrition that Shin might not be able to withstand until the end, it would be precisely this version of Godzilla. Apart from that exception, then yes, the safer dynamic starts to seem collective. You can even imagine the scenario: Kong arriving to disrupt the fight's timing, break the comfort zone, and prevent Shin from getting too free. Godzilla coming right after to keep the pressure high and turn it into a relentless war. And in the middle of all that, the objective would be quite simple: to prevent Shin from orchestrating that massacre the way he might want. And this is where a truly good theory comes in. Perhaps the best way to defeat Shin in this universe isn't to think about who wins in a 1v1, but about who can make this guy more uncomfortable the whole time. Because Shin's worst moment is when he manages to get space, stability, and freedom to impose that pattern of destruction without being interrupted. So the most efficient response would be precisely to ruin that all the time, to touch him, pressure him, push him, change the axis of the fight, and prevent any clean sequence. So for me, this is the most interesting point here. The MonsterVerse might have the strength to take down Shin, but the safest path wouldn't seem like a single fight. It would seem like a continuous beating, without giving a break, without leaving comfortable ground, and without allowing that creature a second of peace to repeat the same pattern of destruction. And this is where the story gets really scary, man. Because in the end, the worst case scenario for the MonsterVerse wouldn't be Shin Godzilla winning everything right away. It would be him surviving. Because dealing with Shin the way he appears at the film's climax is one thing, it's quite another to grapple with the possibility of this creature confronting Kong, Godzilla, and other titans without simply stopping stopping there. And that's the most unsettling aspect of the idea. Shin never gives the impression of being a fully developed monster in what he's shown so far. He seems more like the kind of creature that responds to pressure in an increasingly worse and more terrifying way. And in the MonsterVerse, that pressure would be absurd. We're not talking about a world where he would step in, destroy a few areas, and find only a human army trying to buy time. We're talking about a universe full of violent titans, brutal alphas, and battles on a gigantic scale. So if Shin survived that kind of environment, the fear would no longer be just the scale of the initial destruction. The fear would become what that universe could wreak upon him afterward. Imagine, for example, if after facing Godzilla he found a better way to withstand heavy combat, or if the constant pressure from such absurd monsters pushed his body into an even more brutal energy response. Or worse, if that window of vulnerability after the shocks started to shrink. Then Shin's greatest restraint would begin to disappear, and the scenario would go from dangerous to almost desperate. And there's a point that makes this even more serious. In the MonsterVerse, when a Titan deviates too much from the norm, the impact isn't limited to just that Titan. The entire balance is affected. Territory changes, the reactions of other monsters change, the system itself goes into crisis. So if Shin continued to defy the biological logic of the other Titans, he wouldn't just become another strong monster. He would become such an anomaly that the entire universe would have to respond. So man, the real horror of putting Shin Godzilla in the MonsterVerse isn't just about who would win a fight. It's the possibility that even the final form in the movie might not be the end of the line for this creature. Because if it isn't, then the question stops being, who can stop Shin now? The question becomes, what happens to this universe if this creature still has room to get worse? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. God bless you all. Take care. See you later.